but lots of fun things coming down the pipeline. Now, James, we've done GlenAllachie tastings many times before. Tonight's tasting is a little unique because we've got three, in some ways, very un-GlenAllachie-esque whiskeys. I mean, even the first three, which are experimental casks, they're not what maybe most people think of when they think of GlenAllachie. They're probably thinking sherry cask,
They're
maybe
thinking
a bit
dumpy.
of Bordeaux. What's that?
They're thinking dumpy.
They're thinking dumpy. That's
Yeah, a
right.
few years ago, Andrew, if you had tried to put together a lineup of 7 GlenAllachies without a dumpy sherry, that would have been a challenge. But yeah, Billy's been busy.
Well, and I mean, some of this is experimentation, some of it is market extensions. But then we get into something really unusual, which is the back end of the tasting, which is Meikle Toir, the peated GlenAllachies, which have finally come out. And this is not GlenAllachie's first dalliance with peat. I mean, there's the Lumreek bottlings, but this is a little different because this is their own peated stock as opposed to blending GlenAllachie with something peated.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I imagine a lot of people here, this will be their first time experiencing this stuff, which is fantastic. So,
Well, and as we said in the intro, like when people bought the tasting, um, one of them in particular, the last one, the turbo, is quite hard to come by. I'll be sending out an email tomorrow. You'll have until probably the end of the day to request inclusion in an opportunity to buy it because there's just a tiny amount of it that came into the market. And this kind of feel like this is the most fair way to deal with that. So we'll get to that at the end, but you all want to have a whiskey at this point, I'm assuming. So we're going to start off with the GlenAllachie 11-year Premiere Cru. And if I'd gone through and sorted out the lineup tonight, James, without sampling these whiskeys first, I would not have guessed that this would have been the first of the three wine finishes we were going to try tonight. But I think we leaned on you for the order on this one. So, are there any notes we need to include to people for about this particular year's
yeah, this is
release?
for sure. Yeah, obviously this is the second release. There was the 2012 Cuvée last year, which really is kind of you could argue they just kind of expanded that. They kind of had like a one-off last year that with the 2012. And then yeah, this year you kind of get a set of three. So I mean, I think the story here essentially is that not so much that Billy and Ronan and the team there are like looking to create a statement about wine casks, but more that in their endless pursuit just of casks in general, and it is kind of this obsession that Billy has, is always just trying to source good quality casks, and they're trying to scratch into corners that don't normally get searched. And so the wine world is one place to do that, and they're kind of a unique position that like people actually come to them sometimes with these whiskey casks. So there's kind of a variety of stories behind them, but this particular would be Bordeaux
For sure. And 48% initially matured in bourbon, probably finished a couple of years or at least a year in the Bordeaux cask. And what's interesting about it right off the bat is it's quite pale. I mean, this is not what I might have expected right off the bat. You think wine finishes these days, and a lot of them are, you know, pinkish because they're either red wine or maybe first fill. But I suppose one of the things that I didn't think about that could be a factor here is this could also be a white Bordeaux. It doesn't have to necessarily be red. Or do you know? You might know. I suspect you might know things.
Well, I mean, part of the reason it doesn't, there's a variety of reasons it doesn't say the specific chateau. I mean, even if it did, of course, if it was from certain parts of Bordeaux, it could be either or. But really, there's kind of a blend here going on. And a lot of distilleries, they kind of get in this weird position, in particular with Bordeaux, where, naming the specific names is a challenge. And part of that is because a lot of kind of the wood programs and where these barrels end up is controlled not necessarily by the chateau themselves, but by, wholesalers of barrels. So it's a little bit more complicated for them to, get specific
Mhm.
permission from the owners, unless they're getting them direct, which for most Bordeaux chateau, the barrels just kind of, after they've used them usually 2 or 3 times, they just kind of go off into the nether.
I suppose the exception to that rule is if your distillery is owned by Selma Hayek and her husband, who also own the winery in Bordeaux that the cask came from, and are,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and there are Bordeaux chateaux that have given permission. I mean, I'm sure, the originals that I remember were from Bruichladdich, where he got permission to use the actual chateau names. But
yeah.
yeah, I think that might have been like an ask for permission,
Mhm.
or
But
sorry, ask for forgiveness versus permission
so
scenario.
having said all that, so like in your like you don't have any secret insight as to what these might be or where they're from. Because to me, like what's really interesting about this, um, now granted, my nose, I'm still recovering from a cold that has been a bit of a marathon here. Um, I'm finding it's very spicy. I mean, there was almost something that actually reminded me of Michter's rye for a minute. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely to me comes across as the same flavor profile as that 2012 cuvee, but maybe like even a little bit more kind of, you know, tree fruit pastry kind of character. Like you get a lot of that baked fruit and like cream pastry, right? Like, which it's not something I usually associate. Like, I think it's important to mention that Bordeaux is aged in French oak,
Yeah.
which I mean, we've all, or a lot of us have probably tried Compass Box's Spice Tree. Like French oak gives a very specific palette of flavor that I don't get here at all, which is kind of a surprise.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I'm getting a spiciness to this. Like this is incredibly spicy, but I'm not getting what I would typically think of as traditional or classic wine cask finishing notes. And I think in some ways I well, this isn't always I kind of like it a little more than I thought I would, possibly for that reason.
I get the sense that, you know, there was a long period of time where you get a wine cask finished, and I think it was almost a sense of pride that it like was a little bit pink. And, you could kind of picture what was going on. That the thing that I always look for in wine finished whiskey is volatile acidity, which is basically balsamic vinegar. And I think
Mhm.
even when the casks were getting cleaned properly, you were always getting like I think there was something kind of off that had made it into the whiskey. And I'm sure sometimes it was just literally like probably oxidized wine in the barrel itself that was just making it into the final product. Uh,
Mhm.
Definitely had
Well,
some Bedrieux, ironically, that were very much like that.
yeah, it is interesting. It makes you wonder. Maybe they're rinsing the casks, but as I said before, I mean, how much white Bordeaux is matured in oak?
Well, all of it, pretty
Yeah.
much.
So could this potentially also be like white wine cask? I mean, would you be getting that rich pinkish hue primarily from like the grape skins, like from that like or is it the wood? I
Yeah,
mean,
it's a good question. I mean, look, a lot of Bordeaux, especially if it is, say, from a lesser chateau, a lot of those wines actually don't have a ton of pigment to them. Obviously, they're still red and they're
mhm,
tannic, but these aren't wines that are like, really, really inky, like
or
those, some of the Australian Shiraz you might have in your shop, for instance,
Napa Cab or
or
something
Napa
like
Cabs. Like these are wines that are a little bit lower on the pigment scale.
that. Mhm,
And that I think probably is a factor here too.
yeah,
But I would
interesting.
say more so this is a factor of barrels that have just been properly cared for
Yeah.
and kept
Well,
clean.
I love the fact that I'm not getting any of that sort of mustiness that I often get in bad wine cask whiskeys. Some of them kind of string into acetone, and as you said, they can be very acidic as well. There's a nice balance to this. It's fruity, it's very spicy. Um, I might need to rely on you for some like fancy tasting notes because I kind of feel like my palate is struggling a bit tonight. But it's very
Yeah, no,
drinkable.
that's
I'm really
understandable.
enjoying this.
Yeah, I mean it's what's interesting to me is that the malt underneath is at least competing, which I mean this is a Billy Walker kind of hallmark is that you're getting it's a lot of cask influence for me, but the malt is still showing. Like it
Yeah.
hasn't been smothered. But close. But I think that's why if you're drinking GlenAllachie, that's what you're looking for, right? You want that
Mhm.
like smothered in oak, but just still on that knife's edge of like you still got the supporting malt underneath.
For sure. All right. Well, while we're
Yeah,
on wine, I mean, I guess all of these are wine casks. I don't really always think of port as a wine cask.
yeah.
But I suppose it's fair to characterize it as that because that is what it is. Um, I saw Nick just joined us here. Nick, the tasting order, if you don't have it, is back in the chat. We're moving on to number two. We just finished number one.
Which
Uh,
yeah, I think I'll start this one, Andrew, and just say that all the things we were talking about that the first one didn't have seem to have poked their head out in the second one, which
oh,
is
interesting.
there's there's kind of that musty like volatile acid slash vinegar note on the nose, and we definitely have a touch of pink.
Okay, well, let me put it up on the screen here and we can dive into this one. So, similar story here, primarily matured in ex-bourbon, finished for a period not disclosed, but I think we can agree, James, that the finishing period here is not, you made the reference to Bruichladdich back in the day where sometimes they would call it acing and it
Yeah,
could sometimes be as little as 2 weeks, which was definitely occurring with like wet wine still in the cask, and you'd get like this pinky uh sour concoction. um 10 years old. Do you want to tell us, I mean, you're a wine guy as well as a whiskey guy. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what Grattamacco is?
yeah.
Because
Grattamacco is a wine estate in Tuscany, but most of Tuscany, for those that have been there, it's kind of like in the hills, kind of in the central part of Italy. But there's a part of Tuscany that's right on the coast called Bolgheri, and this is an area that kind of really only started in the 70s. And it was because you kind of had some really forward thinking producers that were really, what they really want to do is plant Cabernet and appeal to an American audience. So there's some really big kind of iconic names that kind of sprung out of this area. Things like Sassicaia and Tignanello are probably the two biggest names. And one of those that kind of is more like, maybe the choice for the more connoisseur Bulgari drinker is a winery called Grattamacco. And that wine, in my experience at least, is like a little bit more kind of authentically Tuscan. It's a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit less made for an American audience, let's say. It's
Mhm.
to me, it's always been interesting. And clearly, Billy has actually gotten like some licensing rights here to use their name, which is cool.
Yeah, I mean, and Gratamico, I think is how you pronounced it, um, does seem like a very Roman word. I mean, it's
Totally.
about as Italian, I think, as you could possibly get. Absolutely beautiful area. I've had the privilege of visiting a couple times. And every time I'm there, I'm struck with, even though things look like they're close distances, they take forever to get to. Um, I don't know how anybody ever conquered that part of Italy. Like, uh, it's all about hills and, you know, ridge lines, and it's a very, very cool place to go.
Right. When you hear like Roman history about like armies marching,
Yeah.
like that must have been pretty brutal.
It and I mean, granted, they eventually they built their roads, but before they built their roads, like I can't even imagine what a nightmare it would have been going on campaign in Tuscany.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's kind of a shame actually. People often go through Tuscany and they don't go anywhere near Bulgari. You kind of have to go there because you are a wine person, I think.
the interesting thing is the less appealing wine notes that were there initially on the nose seem to blow off pretty quickly. It does seem to settle down into more of a leathery, nutty profile.
Yeah, I would describe it more as being off in terms of like that spectrum of flavors. You're right in the
Yeah.
leathery, but
But
it
yeah,
actually, you're
sorry,
right. It drinks very pleasant.
didn't mean to suggest that you were saying that it nosed off. It's just I think you'd suggested that it had some of those wine notes that I said I was
Oh yeah,
grateful I
it
didn't
definitely does, right?
get on the first one.
Yeah, but you don't get the sense that this was an experiment, which is usually, what we all got scarred by those experiment Bruichladdich.
Mhm.
but totally different spectrum of fruit flavors from the first one, which to me was very like baked tree fruit. This is much more that like, dark berry, dark, currant,
Mhm.
that type of stuff.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of malt in there. As you said, some berry fruits. It's a little bit jammy. I mean, to me, it's more like those or shouldn't say less traditional berry fruits, like some of those, jammy like preserves that you see that are out there made from like local berries as opposed to,
Yeah,
you
like
know,
Saskatoon berry type of,
yeah, this is not Shelter Point Farms,
right?
jammy jams.
Yeah, another thing that strikes me with the first two is, the amount of wood influence is, I feel like it's a little bit higher than you expect, considering that the amount of like wine influence is low. But,
Mhm.
maybe a key is that, they probably would be first fill from the winery.
Yeah.
So, they probably have, 2, maximum 4 years of wine maturation on them,
Mhm.
um, which really
And
isn't actually that much for a cask.
no, and I would have to wager that at this point, like Billy must be at the very least rinsing these casks before they're being filled because
Yeah, I know they get steamed for
yeah,
sure.
I'm not getting, I mean, it has that sort of leathery tannic, but it's not sour,
Yeah.
which is, I think I like the profile of the first one a little better. Like I find um it's a bit brighter in style. But, yeah, this is not something that I would, describe as being an unpleasant wine cask profile.
Should we go on to the third one?
Mhm,
I will say I like that the first two are as different as they are because
mhm.
I didn't totally anticipate that.
Well, you don't want them to just be versions of themselves, otherwise, it's kinda boring.
Yeah.
Um,
I should
okay,
say Grattamacco, and this is kind of actually a somewhat important point because a lot of Italian wine is aged in these big 600-liter kind of Eastern European oak casks that do have this really leathery character. But Grattamacco is all French oak.
interesting. So French oak, and now we're off to, the Douro, to Portugal. Pop this one up on the screen, 9 years, so, uh I'm guessing here, like, this is not, like some people maybe would assume right off the bat, a port finish. Is this a Douro wine cask finish, James?
Yeah, that's correct. So, yeah, there's a lot of dry wines, dry red wines, made in
Mhm,
Douro as well. So, a lot of the port companies are connected
mhm,
to those wines. So, like Newport is one that I know has been available in Alberta that are
mhm,
worth picking up. They tend to be these like really full-bodied, very structured, you know, the type of wines you'd like want to have a serious cut of like, grilled red meat with type of wines.
mhm. Well, I mean, it's funny you say that because I mean, and I realize this is a different level of quality, but stepping down to something even as simple as like parakeeta, like there was a time when I first started in the industry 20 years ago, um, like some of my colleagues would be like, "Hey, whenever the parakeeta magnums come out, grab a couple and lay them in your cellar because they'll taste like Bordeaux like 10 years from now."
Yeah, I've
Um,
been fortunate actually. We the shop that I worked at, we used to sometimes get there's a Parakeeta Reserva, and we would get cases of
yeah,
back vintages,
yeah,
one, sometimes as old as 20 years, and they tasted like fresh as a daisy.
yeah.
They just had really disaster corks in them.
Well, it, yeah, I don't think they weren't making it
Yeah, they're
for
from Portugal in the early 80s, which you would think they would have access to good corks, but I think they were sending those off further
Mhm,
north into Europe.
right. Um, Once again, very different from the first two. I mean, it has more of a winey, grapey sort of note
Yeah,
to
it's
it.
got like the beginnings of that jube quality.
Mhm. Like lots of chocolate, lots of leather, tobacco, candied nuts.
Yeah, I know you've seen this cask. Some people have probably seen it. There's a cask of GlenAllachie that we bottled for Canada, um, from a ruby port, and it has a lot of
Coming
this same.
soon.
Yes, yes, It has a lot of these same general kind of qualities to it.
Interesting. And yet that's a port cask.
Yeah.
This is
No.
very chocolatey on the palate. Again, full disclosure, I'm not trusting my palate is at its best tonight. But this is, it's not coming across as whiny as I thought it would be on the palate.
No, on the finish though, this is something that I think I look for in wine finished whiskey is like that spice tree spice that I was talking about from French oak. This has a lot of that on the finish, where it's like it really grips on the back end
Mhm. But
more
I
than
mean,
the first two.
sherry can do that as well too at
Yeah,
times.
you're right.
Um, I I can't believe how chocolatey that is, and uh, yeah, I didn't think about this too clearly before we did the tasting, and I mean, sure, we put the products on our newsletter on our website. I think I just cut and paste. I didn't really look that closely at Douro Cask and what that meant. And I think I just assumed, that's just what they're calling port for some reason. Um, but the funny thing is, this is very port-like
Yeah.
without being port cask.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Yeah, this is almost certainly French oak. It's almost certainly 225-liter casks. So, they're small
Mhm.
and almost certainly would have had a very inky, dark, tannic red wine in it for at least 18 months.
Yeah. Well, it's drinking nicely. Yeah, I've got a lot to think about in terms of what my favorite from those first three are, because I thought I
But we
knew.
can uh we can make that call in the lightning round.
We can. I thought I knew when after we tried the first two, I thought, oh, this is settled. But I'm not so sure anymore. So James, do you want to lead us, like, tell us a little bit before we dive into the next whiskey about like what Meikle Toir is,
Sure.
uh, and like where the name comes from.
Yeah, it's a good question. So Billy Walker, formerly of GlenDronach, Benriach, before that got things fired up at Burn Stewart and was responsible for the distilling regime at Deanston. And I think that experience in particular was what he leaned on here. When they took over GlenAllachie, the distillery had been run at like full tilt, which is a little bit different than what he took over at Benriach and GlenDronach, where there's a pretty good distilling regime in place. At GlenAllachie, I think there was a lot of onus on them to kind of rewrite how things worked, because they were pumping out 4 million liters of spirit out of this distillery, which basically requires like quick distillations, quick ferments. I think the ferments were kind of in that 45-hour range.
Mhm.
Um, really, they were just like pumping the place with the quickest whiskey they could. Um, so the first kind of order of business when they started distilling was like, let's tweak this for a little bit more quality based. And so I think two of those production methods speak to what ended up. I don't think they meant to like arrive at this destination, but the different experiments they did kind of brought them here. So obviously, trying peated spirit at a variety of levels,
Mhm.
um, with peat from a variety of places, was one of the experiments, and they settled on this. Basically, the peat is from a place called St. Fergus, which is kind of way in the northeast, so
Mm.
like north of Aberdeen. There's the St.
Like the
Fergus's
sound
little
of
town.
Saint Fergus.
Yeah, I thought you might be into that. Which I'm pretty sure is where the peat from Ardmore comes from, and I also
Mm.
think it's where the peat that he was using at Benriach.
Mm.
So I'm pretty sure they use Chris Maltings, and there's kind of like a circle of trust there. But the actual peat levels I think kind of vary batch to batch, but in general, the peat, we're used to kind of measuring peat in the malt, would have been for these batches like over 90 parts
Mhm.
per million. So on the packaging, when they bottle it, they actually list the amount in the spirit, which is kind of unusual. So I don't. Is there any other distillery that does that?
Yeah, actually, Torvig
Right, Torvik
does
does that,
that.
of course.
I mean, it's an interesting thing to reflect on, because as much as, and I've always thought this was kind of, as much as Ardbeg and Bruichladdich love to make a big deal of how heavily peated Octomore and the Supernovas are. Like in the case of Ardbeg, you've got your spirit purifier, which means you're redistilling a big portion of your spirit. So you're kind of going for that lighter, more delicate end of the spectrum. And then in the case of Bruichladdich, for anyone who's been there, I mean, the stills are tiny and they're very, very narrow. I mean, they're not Glenmorangie narrow, but they're not that far off of it. And in both cases, you're going to create a very light, delicate spirit in theory through those practices. So how does that influence peat? How much of that peat is coming over? And you know, you talk to some of the guys about like trying to get the phenol levels up. I mean, sometimes I wonder like how much of the phenols is just marketing BS, because how much of it can the malt actually absorb as it's drying, and how much of that actually carries through into the spirit?
Yeah, I know if you go out there and look for, Billy talking about Meikle Toir, he does talk about that sometimes, about how like, really what they're getting. And that's why they focus more on the finish, because I think even the batches that they're getting, like, those numbers are much more of an estimation, where it feels like measuring in the finished spirit is much more of an exact number.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of the onus behind that.
Well, in the end, it really is the only number, because
Yeah.
I mean, use places like Springbank or Lefroy Beaumont with floor maltings as an example. I mean, they can claim that the phenols they have are X, but when you're floor malting it, and that can be influenced by temperature, humidity, where you got your peat from this week. How reliable are the phenols that they quote for their? I mean, and I'm not saying that as someone who like wishes that they were like rigid with it. It's more just, that's a quick, easy number to give to people. Yeah, our malt is peated to 55 ppm.
Yeah, and it is very sexy marketing. I feel like the marketing at Meikle Toir here, a lot of it, I mean, if you followed Billy over the years at Glendronach and at Benrick, and even if, to be honest, even if you look at the Deanston packaging, you realize, like, I mean, he's not necessarily like a marketing genius. That's not what he's known for. I think there's some things that kind of like almost accidentally, kind of over marketed here. For instance, like naming one of them Turbo. Like, I don't think that was like, hey, we're going to grab a lot of attention. I think it was more like, hey, this describes the product. And then afterwards realizing, like, oh my gosh, this is just creating hysteria. I absolutely think they would go back and rename that, but
You
maybe I
don't
shouldn't get
think
too far ahead.
you don't think that calling it Turbo had something to do with appealing to the generation of kids who grew up with Super Nintendo?
No, I genuinely believe that they had nothing to do with that. And that's from Ronan Curry's mouth. I think that, yeah, there's probably another story here. I think that on one hand, they're kind of happy that it's become a phenomenon, but that was not the intent. This was not like, hey, let's experiment and see. I mean, all the peated whiskey at GlenAllachie is essentially an experiment, because they were running all these, you know, variety of experiments. Like, for instance, the the distillation now and the fermentation is happening at 160 hours, right?
Hmm.
Well, some of the early batches, they push to 4 and even 500 hours.
Yeah.
Now, the reason they can do that, again, Billy is not like, hey, I want to make like a fruitier, more complex spirit. Really, I think the main reason that he is obsessed with these long ferments is because he hates when the ferment is shorter, you get more foaming in the still. And this was the problem they dealt with at Benriach, where the foam would go up into the still and burn on the sides, and then they would get like a burn flavor in the spirit. And
Mm.
it drove him nuts. So when you let it distill, like all that kind of goes away, and they don't have to deal with it the same way. And I actually think that might be, I mean, again, it doesn't say that in the market material. I think that might have been more of the incentive here to do a long ferment than the good quality of spirit that they ended up with.
James, you're going to break people's hearts by telling that story.
I know.
All right. So
No,
so
there's some happy. Meikle Toir contains some happy accidents, but I think that's part of the joy of what
right,
Meikle Toir is.
right. So back to Meikle Toir. It's peated
Yep.
GlenAllachie. The
Yeah,
name.
insanely long ferments, which they can do because it's stainless steel tanks. If
Yeah,
you have wood tanks, it's tricky to do that because you have, of course, bacteria that lives in the wood, no matter how well you clean it.
yeah. And means big pursuit. And correct me, was that because they were trying to like make a heavily peated malt? Is that what they meant by that?
Well, I think that when they started doing these heavily peated experiments, they realized right away that they had something, and that
Hmm.
they had created a new make that none of them had ever really kind of come across before, and that it was like, okay, this is a thing,
Hmm.
and so that's why they pursued that.
All right. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, let's start off with the Meikle Toir original. Uh, this is your classic, if you will, your Octomore point one,
yeah,
uh, the straight bourbon. I mean, this is what you need to kind of get a sense of what Meikle Toir is. It's the
yeah. I
straight.
agree. This is a showcase more for the malt than the wood, even though there is absolutely virgin oak. There is some rye casks that have
Mhm.
ended up in here, but it's a little bit more naked than the following three.
Yeah. What's interesting to me right off the bat, someone mentioned they found a little bit of a barnyardy note in it. Just nosing it is right off the bat, like again, nose is not perfect this week. As much as I do get a little bit of smoke, I'm getting more fruit off of it than I am smoke. I'm getting more vanilla and honey off of it than I am smoke. I'm getting lots of malt. Um, and it's not rough. Like this is 5-year-old whiskey, and I'm not finding it rough or sharp.
No, and that's another thing in the terms of the happy accident. Like, in 2017, Billy didn't say like, "Hey, let's release this at 5 years old." That actually was not the plan at all.
Mm.
But I think they were following this stuff and realizing like, if we wait longer, we might actually miss a pretty compelling window of 5-year-old peat.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the peat levels were starting to actually decline, like the phenol
we,
level.
I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but there's a reason why, people who like heavily peated whiskey tend to like younger whiskeys because the longer it's in cask, the more that peat starts to fade, the more it mellows, the more it's overlaid by oak. So if you really want to like emphasize the peat, the whiskey needs to be young, and I think this works really well. Um, there's a really weird like I mean it's got this sort of fruity, sweet fruity note on the palate that I can't quite pin my uh, put my finger on, but I don't know, it almost makes me for some reason think of Switzerland and like eau de vie.
Yeah, it's very much like an herbaceous. I know, Kevin's talking about the mint quality. It actually reminds me of something. I don't know if you had access to this, but when I was in high school, you could get these. They were basically like cigarettes for surfers that had cloves and mint in them,
Like,
and
and
it
are these
reminds
like somehow illegal underage cigarettes?
yeah, it sounds suspiciously like you're onto something there.
Right.
Um, but I think like the mint was actually like cured or fermented.
Mm.
I mean, who knows how it was processed, but there's actually mint, not just like sprayed in, but actual leaves. And this reminds me a lot of that.
It is quite herbaceous. It's got a nice spiciness to it, whether that's the rye or the virgin oak. Um, and the smoke it's a clean smoke. It's not a really like medicinal Isla smoke. It's more of like an ashy, woody smoke.
Hmm. What Obviously there's a wider spectrum than ever of peated makes out there now in Scotland.
Mhm.
I mean, if you were served this blind, I think the question is like, where does your head go? Like it does remind me a lot of early Octomores,
I, I,
but
I, but and one interesting factoid about that, Octomores don't use, or at least now predominantly don't use Isla peat.
no, I don't think they ever have.
I think there might have been like the first, like some early incarnations. It was either that or Port Charlotte. It might have been Port Charlotte where they had some
Right.
early.
They had a few early. I know Jim hated it. He thought that the Isla Peat just turned out too kind of austere out of their stills.
Yeah, in terms of what does it remind me of? Uh, I think the only two that I would say would probably be something like either Ben Riach or like peated Glenturret would be the two that I see a bit of a similarity to. How about yourself? Is there like something that you think that it's reminding you of?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely reminded me of early Octomores. I mean, yeah, you're probably aware, like my early days in the business were right when Bruichladdich was being kind of launched in Western Canada. So yeah, I remember, not loving them at the time and being much more obsessed with like the Port Charlotte releases. But yeah, I mean, certainly that spectrum is very familiar because
Mhm.
also those had a lot of wood influence too.
Mhm.
There was kind of this like balance of like heavy wood influence and then like very assertive peat that kind of somehow came together and worked.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting style. I think it is noticeably not coastal Isla. You're not getting a saltiness or anything like that coming out in it. So it is a unique profile. But I think it really works too. Why don't we move on to what do we have next? The Chinquapin. Um, this is just on a personal level. I don't know why, but I for some reason I have a dislike of the word Chinquapin. And I don't know what it's rooted in. It's probably just something in my brain. It seems like a ridiculous word.
Well, and it also isn't spelled the way you anticipate.
No, but I mean, many words in Scotland aren't spelled the way
Well,
you
you probably
anticipate.
noticed too that even within the whiskey business, American versus Scottish, even there's different spellings of Chinkapin that show up,
Mhm.
which also doesn't help.
No.
But yeah,
Yeah.
Chinkapin is essentially is a type of virgin oak. There, yeah, I mean, I'm always familiar with Chinkapin because we also import Michters, and the early batches of Shanks and Bombergers were finished in Chinkapin oak. That's evolved a little bit where now just Bombergers is actually matured in Chinkapin oak. And yeah, you might remember we kind of got into that with Andrea a little bit about a couple summers ago, where
Mhm.
she talked about how they always noticed that these Chinkapin barrels, they were like her favorite barrels in the warehouse because, whereas a lot of other oak varieties tend to like take you into these savory elements, like Chinkapin is just like more sweetness.
Mhm.
It's like more toffee, more developed sugars. Um, they tend to be just very friendly.
Mhm. Because I mean, it is another species of American oak. Um, if I remember.
Yeah, like I think yeah, I don't know how you would describe that. Like it's still American white oak,
Yeah.
technically. But yeah, I think, the other thing is that probably for a very long time, there's a lot of Chinkapin that just ended up as regular staves in other bourbon barrels.
Right.
And then someone figured out that, like, hey, this is like a tiny bit different species. Let's slap a 20% bonus price on these barrels and call them Chinkapin.
Hey,
And so good. Hopefully that guy got a raise.
can you still call it straight bourbon?
Yes.
I guess you
Yes, you
can. It's
can.
American white oak.
Yes.
Um,
Andrew, you could line up 10 Chinkapin barrels and age it like a few years in each one, all brand new. And I think it's still technically bourbon.
there you go. Well, don't they literally just have to like dribble across the surface of the oak and you can call it bourbon?
Yeah, right. As long as yeah, why hasn't someone done that?
I don't know, like someone should release that and just like white dog that you literally drain across an oak stave because you can and call it bourbon.
Right.
That
Because I think if it's under 2 years, you have to put the age exactly. Right.
yeah,
So yeah, why can't someone like get it down to the second?
like seconds, like 5 second bourbon. I would buy it just for humor's sake.
I mean, it kind of sounds like something that boutique whiskey company would put out.
Well, I'm gonna have to talk to Sam about that. I'll put that in his brain.
Yeah.
It's opening up the more it sits in my glass. It is very toasty. There's a lot of fresh oak there. The malt is still present. The smoke's there again, struggling with my nose. Some nice honey tones. What are you getting, James?
Yeah, that's what I noticed too, is like this step up of the amount of wood, basically. So yeah, just that like balance of malt and the peat to the wood is just shifted from the original. Um, but yeah, it still feels like it's in balance.
Hmm. I hate how this word is overused these days, but I think it is appropriate here. This feels a little elevated
Yeah.
over the last one. Like a nice concentration of sweetness, of fruit. Um, but it is almost like it's bordering on, and I know this is only a 5-year-old, even though I know this is far from being over oaked, but it's bordering on almost being a little too woody for me. It's almost like I can taste like splinters of the wood in the spirit.
Yeah, it'd be very easy to be critical of this if you're someone that looks for like very old school, naked malt. That this is anything but that. But experience has taught me that there's a lot of whiskey drinkers in Canada that we're looking for that knife edge of right on the line of like at the extreme of wood and malt flavor and peat and everything. And this checks a lot of those boxes. It's loaded.
I was one of those people 15 years ago. I've
Yeah.
matured considerably since then. And I typically find that whiskeys like that are best placed in a cocktail. Not suggesting this one specifically, but those knife edge whiskeys you speak of.
Yes. Well, I'm funny. I'm a little bit like that too. Like I think my palate aligns with yours a little bit. Like I love things like that 24-year-old Bunnahabhain that is in the market, right? Like old refill cask. Like that's great. I love that. I love that flavor spectrum, tropical fruit. But I do find myself occasionally, like now that I have a bottle of Meikle Toir sherry on my shelf, I've reached for it a surprising amount of times in the last month.
There you go.
And I think that always yeah, tells the real story.
Will comment it has a softer smoke than the last one. Uh, I'm finding that a little bit too, although the smoke to me seems a little darker. It's almost more like coal dust smoke. Like there's this really blackened,
Yeah.
but that might be the oak. That might be those two things sort of
Yeah, that
cross.
kind of like sweet minty quality that the original has feels like it's been suppressed a bit here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, on to the sherried one or the sherry one. I
And this
think I
is PX and Oloroso. Should mention the size of batches here. They actually talk like the packaging is very almost like compass box-esque, where they really actually get into some specifics. Yeah, so PX and Oloroso, I think that there is less than 10 casks that go into these batches. That information is out there somewhere, but
Well, I mean, I think the case quantities, if I remember correctly, might have even been on their website. I mean, GlenAllachie
yes.
does typically give
Yeah,
you
I think
that.
there are about 1,500 cases per. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, believe it or not, of course, the amount of turbo versus the other ones is actually not as far off as you might believe by the availability.
Really.
I think turbo is about a third.
It all went to Sweden.
No, it all went here, but everyone had this idea that they only wanted one bottle and it was the turbo. That's right. It was more of a human nature question than an actual whiskey availability question.
Or preference. I mean,
That's true too.
just people haven't tried it. I mean, that's the people want the one that's most limited, even if it's not necessarily better.
Yeah, before we talk about this actual whiskey too, I'll answer one more question that Will had, which is will they stick at 5 years? Or will they be releasing older statements? The answer is yes.
Very clear. Yeah. Hope everyone understood that answer.
Yeah, it's yes to both. I think we will see one day there will be a Meikle Toir 30, but there will also still be a Meikle Toir 5.
Yeah. Well, and I think if they're really honoring this style, like the bulk of it needs to be bottled when it's going to drink the way you want it to.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So the sherry one, yeah, this is how I know I am not the best of tasters tonight because my nose is struggling to pick up sherry on this, but I am getting peat.
Yeah, you kind of it's a different spectrum of sherry. Like to me, it's a lot of that kind of milk chocolate. Maybe some dried red fruit in there, but I think the peat like pushes it into that kind of leathery, like single origin chocolate, maybe even like really good quality roasted coffee.
Hmm. Well, I like that comment about really good roasted coffee. It's making me think of like coffee and donuts right now.
Right?
I can see a bit of a synergy in the smoke between the Chinquapin and this one.
Mm.
Um, there is some nice chocolate, dark fruit on this, a bit of a like a maple syrup sweetness to it. Um, but yeah, this is a nice fusion of like peat and sherry.
Yeah, I would agree with Kevin. The finish doesn't feel quite as expansive on this. I feel like the sherry is put like almost a clamp on the back end. Like the first two have a little bit more of a fan out where you get kind of some more like spectrum of the peat. Whereas here you get like, to me, the peat has become very one dimensional on the finish and it's very like tobacco.
Mhm. But I mean that's not that surprising. I mean, uh, again, one of the reasons why I think bourbon is usually the best cask for peated whiskeys is that sherry is going to mask some of that, whether it's your Ardbeg Ugadale, uh, you know, the classic like Lagavulin Distillers Edition and PX Sherry, uh, all of those different peated whiskeys don't come across as peated because I think sherry is hiding some of those tones. And for some people, they like that because maybe it makes that peat a little bit more approachable.
Totally. Yeah, I kind of picture like some of these sherry casks that do make it like past 20 years old and just get like really, really over sherried, but then still have the peat. Like there could be some really fun casks of Meikle Toir in the sherry spectrum, maybe down the road that,
Mhm.
are a little bit more interesting to me. But they'll still be like, one glass wonders, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I think about this one. Like this is the one that I have on my shelf because it's the only one I could source. But yeah, our friends at the LDB wanted to wait 4 months to release it. So oh well.
So when's it coming out?
Yeah, I know things are so different in BC. Yeah, the first week of June. So there's no turbo in BC. It's all in Alberta. And we gave the sherry one to the private stores and the original and Chinquapin to the BC liquor stores.
So the
So
sherry's that's why the sherry's out.
that's why I have a bottle of sherry.
Again, the speed round will tell. Maybe actually for myself redoing this tasting in a few days' time or a week when my palate's best would tell the tale. Just for right now, James, the funny thing is I'm finding the sherry one the most drinkable of the three.
Yeah. Well, I will say, like, I've gotten so much interaction and feedback about Meikle Toir. It genuinely like has taken me off guard. Like people love this stuff. They love the price. They love the profile. Um, but in terms of like, yes, you would think like that everything gets pushed towards the turbo. I would not say that the amount of people that have said turbo is their favorite that have tried all four. Like it's pretty split amongst the four,
Yeah.
which that was the intention.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the turbo and before we muddy those waters, just commenting on one of the things you just said about price. I mean, on one level, they are pricey for 5-year-old whiskeys, but I think when we're talking comparables, I think GlenAllachie viewed these as being somewhat comparable to something like Octomore, which is 5 years of age, and which start at 290, if my memory is correct in terms of pricing.
Mm.
Uh, yeah, they are reasonably priced, and I think I'm hoping that we'll see more of that from producers where they're going back to remembering that you know their consumer. I don't want to say they forgot their consumers were important, but they
Mm.
they got a little greedy, as it
Well,
were.
yeah, and you're seeing those signs, right? I mean, we saw. I mean, I don't fully understand the story of this, but I know Ardnamurchan, the AD bottlings, went down in price. I
Yeah,
know you probably noticed that, like Ben Romick 10 and 15 went down in price this
yeah,
month. Like we dropped them down back to the price they were in 2021.
Yep.
If you would, so Ronan Curry and Andrew Mustard played a game with me on this and our team where they said, like, what price do you think it's going to be and what price do you hope it's going to be? And we had to write it down on paper. And I wrote retail that I thought it would be 149, but I hoped it would be 129 retail.
Oh
So
man, I wish I could have played that game with him too.
what would your numbers have been? And even in
For
the chat,
the,
I'm curious, like if someone
for,
told you there's going to be a GlenAllachie, like sherry, it's going to be called the Turbo. It's like an Octomore kind of wannabe a little
at
bit
5 years of age,
at 5 years of age. What would you guess the
I
price?
would have guessed it was going to be 120, but would have hoped it would be, you know, 80. But like, I know that's ridiculous, but I think there's some good rationale in this. And I think companies, and James, you've probably been in on a tasting where I've said this before. Like, how do you charge $150 for 5-year-old whiskey when you can buy Craigellachie 13 at 46% and it's good for like 70, somewhere between 55 and $75?
Yeah. Yeah,
How do you do
I
that?
know. You know what? I probably people in the business hate that I have this opinion, but um, I think the business can be profitable at this type of a level. Like,
Mhm.
that's we've forgotten that, and it's been it's been a juicy day for the Scotch business, and you could argue
Well,
that it's worth that. And there's lots
but
of other products in the alcohol business that have good margins, and they're providing great products, so good for them, right? I mean, that's true of lots of businesses.
But I think it's a bigger, it's not, I mean, it's partly them, but then it's also like what do marketing companies charge for a rebrand and custom bottles? I mean, all those things can have an impact on it. But I will say like 95, that's lower than I would have guessed they would have pinned these at.
Yeah, me too.
Um, and I mean, they're
Rest
limited
assured, I will fight to keep it that way.
and they're limited as well, right? Like these are not, it's not as though it's a
Yeah.
one-off, but they're
So
going
the
to be.
production at GlenAllachie last year, I think, was about 900,000 liters, and about 10% of that was peated. So not a lot.
And well, just on that point though, like this is something where, is this a once annual release? Is it going to be dribbled out a couple times a year? Like,
Yeah, I know there's some questions about that earlier. Yeah, I don't know if I'm at liberty to say that, but I think like the long-term goal is that it kind of is a little bit rare, but not,
yeah.
it's something that you might want to pounce on when it does become available, but it'll be gettable always.
Mhm.
I know that's a vague question response, but
Mm.
I unfortunately think the turbo will always be
Yeah.
rare, but um, yeah,
Well,
hopefully
James,
not as rare as the first batch.
you straddled the razor's edge on that one, so well done. Uh, I just got to go back and find it. Let's talk
What I
about
can say is there's more Meikle Toir on the water. Is that
nice.
a little bit less
That's,
vague?
that is less
Another
vague.
market that didn't take their full allocation, I snagged a bit. So
Nice. You gotta love it when they don't do that, especially for stuff like this. All right,
mhm,
the turbo.
mhm.
I've had to switch to GlenAllachie's or to Meikle Toir's website rather, because this is not on our site. As I said before, we have a handful of bottles of this, literally a handful, available by ballot to tasting participants tonight. I'll send an email about that tomorrow. But James, tell us about the turbo, because this one it's not just about the oak on this one.
Yeah, the original idea actually behind Meikle Toir, again, lots of experimentation. I believe the original batches, which this would be a part of, when they were tasting and they were, really kind of figuring out like, hey, what is peated GlenAllachie going to be about? They actually, I believe, cast these at 4 different cut points. So they split the whiskey coming off the still, the first few minutes of the run, the second quarter, the third quarter, the fourth quarter, however that actually broke down, I'm not exactly sure. But I think the original idea was that Meikle Toir was going to be like split up, not by cask type, but by cut point. Now, thankfully, someone realized that that's like maybe a little too indulgent, but they did take the highest phenol count portion of that cut, and they have bottled that completely separate. So, yeah, I had someone explain to me that probably the final phenol count in like a bottle of Ardbeg is close to 15, most likely.
Mhm.
And that even for Octomore, this would be high at 71 parts per million in the final spirit.
Mhm. Um, and then bourbon, virgin oak, and Oloroso sherry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, clearly there's some sherry influence here, but yeah, they've definitely tried to fight back a little bit with the cask.
Uh, I personally, and we'll have to put this on the list for Andrew, presumably next time he's out this way. I would really love to try this just in bourbon.
I can tell you that that exists for a fact,
Yeah,
but that has not yet been released.
because I mean the nose, I'm finding it's almost, again, my nose is not really operating right, but I'm almost finding it's like too intense to get much out of. The palate though is really intriguing. Like it is very oily, dark, tons of licorice. Um,
Yeah, it feels like there's so much packed in here that it's kind of tough to like sift through it all and really kind of get that, to break it down. It
it's
really comes at you with a lot.
it's almost like drinking Fernet.
Yeah, I have a tough time disagreeing with that. Like where it's just there's a lot.
It's like chocolate, mint,
So are you
tar.
suggesting that maybe if this was diluted with a slightly more modest vermouth of some sort, that you might create something that you might. I mean, I'm sure someone's done it.
I mean, I do like to make cocktails with expensive whiskeys, partly
Well,
because
this is look. How many bars across the street from your establishment are making bourbon cocktails with bourbons that cost well over the cost of this Meikle Toir Turbo?
but
Like, I don't think that's a total crime.
no, partly because it's bourbon. Um, but just kidding. Um, but this is so limited that it would be kind of a shame to do that. Like,
Yeah.
mm,
Well, yeah, I know. This is what I've learned in this process is there are plenty of palates especially in Canada, where there's a lot of people that could sit down and have 3 or 4 of these drams and like enjoy every sip. For
mhm,
me, this would be like I would fatigue of drinking this
yeah,
more than the previous 3.
yeah. But
But
it's
but I respect it.
but James, that's kind of like I if I have a glass of Fernet, by which I mean a tiny 1 ounce glass of Fernet,
Yeah.
I don't usually have a second. So it's not a multiple glasses kind of beverage. Um, I wish I had a glass of this tonight. I think this would be a good alternative to cough syrup. Probably not,
Well,
but I'll tell myself
you could
that.
argue then that maybe the cocktail here has got to be hot toddy, right?
It tastes better than Buckley's, but I don't know if it's going to work.
It's
So
it's just the turbo.
it's the turbo. All right, James, speed round, and then I'm hoping on a prayer that Evan created a poll, which we've at some point decided is his responsibility solely because he's the one who sets up all the Zoom links and associated things.
Have you
Uh,
noticed when he's on these tastings and you make a comment about the polls, he looks like the face that he has is like he's the middle child that just realized like he got less of a Christmas gift than his older and younger brothers.
oh, and you know what I'm realizing? He didn't create a poll, but oh, well, I don't know if he like because he also posts the post tasting videos to YouTube, but I can't imagine he watches the whole video because he just has to crop the front and the back end. But we'll
Well, we
cobble
can put it in
something
the chat.
together. What's that?
For the brave people, we could put it in the chat always.
Oh, for sure. All right.
Yeah.
Speed
Speed
round,
round?
James. Yeah. Premiere Cru. It's kind of funky.
Yeah, much more. It's kind of got this exotic candy note that's come out that wasn't there before.
It's yeah, like if
Almost a bit of like a whipped cream kind of quality too.
I mean if it would be like if Jelly Belly created like cleaning agent flavored Jelly Bellies
Yes.
and then mixed them in with the fruit ones.
There's a little bit of that like fresh baked sourdough kind of quality that's come out too. Very
Mm.
cool. Yeah,
Well, it's funny
sponge
you
cake
say
is a good call.
sourdough because I'm getting sourdough now on the Grattamacco.
Yeah, actually, now that you say that, it's that's a much more prominent smell here. Like the leatheriness has kind of gone a little bit more
Hmm.
less leathery.
It's very doughy. It has what I imagine lemongrass tastes like because I've never been tempted to eat lemongrass or wheat germ or any of those sort of things.
Yeah, it still has a lot of oak on the finish, but probably not as much as the next one.
Mm. Okay. Douro.
Are you getting a little bit of lactic note on it this time around?
Yes. And kind of like a coffee herbal liqueur thing. Not quite as frenetic as the turbo, but it's sort of going in that direction.
Yeah, I should clarify. When I say lactic, usually that just refers to, something kind of dairy based, whether it's cheesy or I know some people call it like baby puke, or I've heard all sorts of spectrums of describing that.
One, it's funny how like well, because there's that whole baby puke Brooklady,
Yeah.
um, and like some of it is not drinkable. And then people will try and tell you it's a style, and it's like, no, it's just not drinkable. I mean, you can
And the
drink it.
turbo's a style too, Andrew.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think that's anyway. But no, none of these are like that. None of these are baby vomit. Lactic. Okay.
Okay, going on to the original, I got to say your suggestion of the cleaner on the Grattamacco really is influencing my Meikle Toir original because it definitely has that like pine salt cleaner character now.
Hmm.
It
Or
uh it kind of reminds me, when you smoke
like
a
lemon
cigar,
pledge.
yeah, lemon pledge. Though that like lingering like tobacco flavor that just like lingers on your palate after you smoke a cigar.
Hmm. Yeah. I can see that on this.
It's very persistent on the finish.
It's just a very ashy, tarry. Like they put tar in cigarettes. Do they put tar in cigars as well?
No, they don't. No, in
No.
fact, I believe most cigars are organic.
There you go. Still carcinogenic, just a little
Well,
bit.
just from the burning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone tried to convince me if you smoke them slower, there's less.
Mm. But isn't like tobacco carcin like because chewing tobacco is carcinogenic as well, isn't it?
That I think though does have things added to it.
Well, yeah, like fiberglass, which is
Yeah.
not super organic.
If someone ships you a bottle of whiskey and it breaks, but you can sip some out of the bottom, is that the same as the fiberglass you get from chewing tobacco?
Well, I don't know, like how I mean, I've saved whiskey through coffee filters.
Right?
There are ways around, but yeah, like that, you don't do it. Just probably throw it away.
Okay.
Chinquapin. Like if Evan had a poll tonight, I would say add a poll as to what should Chinquapin be renamed to.
Well, I'm sure they thought about calling it virgin oak.
Well, not from GlenAllachie's perspective, just in general. I
Yeah.
think like the world needs to come up with a better name than Chinquapin. Unless there's like a really good story behind it, then I apologize for everything I've said.
Yeah, maybe they could call it like Ozark oak or Missouri oak
Like if
or
it's
whatever.
named for like an extinct, indigenous group, then by all means keep it. Uh, if it's
I,
because
I,
like
I don't
some
know.
white toothless guy came up with, oh, that's Chinquapin oak, then get rid of the name, replace it. Sherry, what do you think of the sherry? It reminds me of like chocolate milk on the nose. There's something.
Mhm. No, chocolate milk is a note that I've heard people refer to, like when I brought this out tasting it. Um, I think it's because like these whiskeys do have a fair amount of texture to them. Like there
Mhm.
is a bit of a creaminess,
Yeah.
and then that sherry is also very creamy.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know, Kevin, if anyone's going to call it Muhlenberg oak. That's not an improvement.
No, I mean they're both terrible, unless one of them is the indigenous word for that, in which case we will accept it begrudgingly. But like, God, it's just the worst name. It's my least favorite name in the oak spectrum of names.
Holy, yeah, that turbo is what I will say about the turbo is, you know, when you do those tastings where everything's like 46 and under, and there's like that magic cast strength at the end,
Yeah,
and you finally, only when you go through the second time do you feel like you can really kind of dissect that cast strength whiskey. There's a little bit of that phenomenon here.
this is like a mic drop malt. Like the tasting's
Yeah.
over. We're
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
We
You
don't
mean you don't go from here to like Glencaddam 15
no,
as
no.
like
You can barely go back to the GlenAllachie 11 Premiere Cru.
yeah.
Um, oh, we've got a name. The common name refers to the resemblance of foliage to chinkapins. But do we know what chinkapins are? Castana. Yeah. It's just some old people in Latin and books.
Yeah, that's what it reeks of, right? Like the Latin snuck its way into the regular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like Grattamacco.
Yeah,
It's a little
exactly.
it's a little awkward.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't you all, because we don't have a poll, I'll give you a couple minutes if you want to put your favorites into the chat here. Um, I can see John's already jumped in with the turbo and the Douro. Uh, I kind of need to go back through them one more time. James, how confident are you on your picks here?
Well, yeah, I've been fortunate. I've had a number of opportunities in the last year to have all four Meikle Tours side by side. And I will state that I consistently like the original more than the turbo. The original is my favorite in the lineup. I
Mhm.
just think the whole point of the exercise is to like show off this new type of peated whiskey, and I just feel like the original does that better than the turbo does, even though the
Mhm.
turbo is kind of its own unique thing.
Mhm.
Um, and
Okay.
then yeah, I will pick as a runner up. I actually really enjoyed the Grattamacco. I wish it was a little bit more kind of a soft landing on the finish, but the aromatic spectrum is pretty interesting.
Yeah. Uh, I'm still working through them, still trying to come up with a final decision. Uh, I liked the original. I just don't know if that's my second favorite or if it's it might be, you know what? It might be the sherry one.
So you're picking turbo number one?
Yeah, the turbo is just, I mean, that's unique. It's interesting.
Hmm.
It drinks well for 59%. Like it shouldn't work, but it does. Uh, I love the GlenAllachie, the sherry one, because it's bringing me back to my late teens and early 20s playing hockey. And at the end of the game, going to like the closest convenience store and getting one of those 1 liter jugs of chocolate milk and just chugging it. Um,
Yeah.
can't do that anymore.
No, well,
Uh,
I'll be honest, Andrew. My brother and I, we used to come home. We'd play GoldenEye. We would take the Nestle Quick and just squirt it right in a full 4 liter of like white milk. My mom, I can only imagine what she really thought of us doing this, and we would just split it while we played Golden.
it's, I would say your poor mother, but probably all mothers.
You know what? I think she was just happy that we were consuming those calories in that fashion and not like emptying out the cupboard in other ways.
Yeah, my mom used to complain about the price of the grocery store tab, but back in the day, but now she complains a lot more about how much the grandchildren eat. So, you know, bit of a bit of a double standard there.
Just a little.
All right, I've decided. Yeah, the turbo is my favorite. This is one of those examples where I didn't want it to be my favorite, but it is my favorite because it's just it's just the most interesting. I love the sherry one. Uh, my honorable mention is going to the Grattamacco, God, I don't think I'm ever going to get that right as well. But my third favorite is the original. I think my favorites tonight are peat heavy. I really like the. I thought, James, I've had a chance to try things over time. I saved these for tonight because I thought it would be kind of fun to try them all together. I'm glad I did because I was worried these were going to be a gimmick, and I don't really feel like they're a gimmick.
Yeah, I was worried about that too, but you're right. It would be hard to make that argument.
Mhm.
The
So
turbo maybe a little.
yeah, but you know what? They've added an interesting element to the pantheon of Scotch whiskey, to peated whiskey as well. Like these are not Islay whiskeys, they're not coastal whiskeys. This is something really different, and kudos to them because I think this is an interesting. Any distillery can peat malts, release it as a different release, but this is something that's got you know some concise and clear branding behind it, other than this is just what our whiskey tastes like when we peat it. This is, there's more to it. So going through the chat here, it's frankly all over the place. Craig has numbered them, he's gone through them all. I love that. Original and turbo sticking out. H has got Grattamacco and then turbo. Robin and Shannon have got the Premiere original sherry and then Premiere Chinquapin and turbo. Original turbo. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of the Meikle Tours showing up in here.
Yeah. Well,
People are
maybe
really digging the turbo. They're gonna have to make more turbo.
well, there's yeah, I mean, look, there's 5 more years of turbo sitting in the warehouse ready to be released. So turbo will be back. That I can confirm. I was going to say maybe the thing that stands out to me now going back is that when you traded these two GlenAllachie tastings, yeah, I kind of thought these wine casks might get kind of drowned out, but they don't. So
No, they
yeah,
stood
it's
up.
amazing how that worked.
They were more interesting than I thought they were going to be.
Yeah,
And I realize I don't mean that as a slight at GlenAllachie. It's just it's they're not things that I'm normally interested in, but they were more spirit forward than I was expecting them to be, and they were all different, which I think is cool. Um, but I think there's also an element of people out there that like peat, and I don't know if these are GlenAllachie drinkers tonight or if these are peat drinkers, and that's why they embraced this particular lineup.
well, I think I've been on some tastings where people have tried to draw a line between like early batches of GlenAllachie 12 and the Meikle Tours, which I think is a massive stretch. but maybe, but maybe.
As Kevin said, we're whiskey drinkers. I also loved how there was a comment there, Kevin, like kind of like the 4 liters of vodka, which for those who don't know, is a reference to, I believe, T-Rex Distillery in Edmonton that was selling 4 liters of vodka in a milk jug for $50. Turns out that was not the PR they were looking for.
It has since been banned.
Yeah, well, and rightly so. I mean, they were able to get away with the Alberta craft laws and craft taxes by blending neutral grain alcohol with 20% of their own production. And that's how that was possible. So it's good that was, because I mean, anyone who's buying that, I guess we can make the argument that all drinking is harmful to a certain extent. But 4 liter plastic jugs of vodka for $50 is that's
It's cheeky
yeah.
at best.
Yeah, at best. Anyway, awesome lineup, James. Thank you very much for doing this with me tonight. We have another one in 2 weeks of GlenAllachie. Quite a different lineup from tonight's.
Yeah, I'm happy to share the turbo with, I realized right away after I kind of saw people messaging me saying, where can I get the turbo?
Mhm.
When I knew they didn't have any of the other ones. And I'm just glad that we were able to at least get it into some people's mouths. So you know, our company did squirrel away a few bottles, and it'll show up at some festivals. Like I've got a bottle for Victoria Whiskey Festival, and yeah.
James, Kensington Wine Market's got an Isla and Isla Alternatives Festival coming up.
Well, you have more bottles in the shop. What you do with them, Andrew, is up to you.
Oh, well, we
Hey, I
offered
topped
them to
one up
these
for tonight.
people. We offered them to the good folks on this tasting. But that's fair. No, you know what? For the same reason, James, that's why we do things like this, like put them in a tasting, because
Totally.
we're not interested in the people who are just looking for trophies or something to flip. We want people to engage with us, to try them. And if you really like it and you want a bottle, you can put your name in the hat and maybe you'll get one. So, and
Yeah.
it's as transparent as that. Anyway, thank you for this, James. Everyone, thank you very much for taking part in tonight's tasting. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully by next Tuesday with Compass Box, my palate will be back to 100%.
Yeah,
Mainly
spoiler alert, Metropolis is not as bold as these whiskeys.
oh, that is a spoiler, but it also sounds kind of intriguing, so I'm excited. Anyway, James, once again, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Have a great week, and see some of you again next Tuesday.